Bon matin. Uh, on behalf of GRAFICS and the Canada Research Chair in Cinema and Media Studies, it is my pleasure to present our keynote speaker today, William Uricchio, with his presentation entitled Interaction, Algorithmic Assembly, Embodied Montage, Organizing Sequence and Time in New Media Settings. As it is a keynote presentation, it is a 40-minute presentation followed by a 20-minute question period. William is professor of comparative media studies at MIT and professor of comparative media history at Utrecht University. He has held visiting professorships at Stockholm University, the Freie Universität Berlin, the University of Science and Technology of China, Philipps Universität Marburg, and Georg August Universität Göttingen. His research has been supported by Guggenheim, Fulbright, and Humboldt fellowships and the Berlin Prize. His scholarly research, at MIT, Uricchio is principal investigator of the MIT Open Documentary Lab. His scholarly research considers the interplay of media technologies and cultural practices in relation to the reconstruction of representation, knowledge, and publics. In part, he researches and develops new histories of old media when they were new, early photography, telephony, film, broadcasting, and today's new media. And in part, he investigates media cultures and their audiences through research into such areas as peer-to-peer communities and cultural citizenship, media and cultural identity, and historical representation. He is currently completing a manuscript on the concept of the televisual from the 17th century to the present, and a manuscript on the cultural work of algorithms. Welcome, William Uricchio.
So I just want to say thanks. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And what I really like about coming here in particular, last time I was here, we were talking about early television. And it forces me to not do what I usually do, not talk about my normal work, but actually to sort of stretch a little bit. So my comments will be tentative a little bit today, but for me, they've been very generative. It's really helped me to think ahead. So I'm grateful for that. Grateful also to Andre and the organizers for having me here. And I also want to apologize. I'm organizing a conference in Montreal, and tomorrow's the big day, but today's the crazy day. It's at Centre Phi. We've been working with Centre Phi for a conference on the preservation of interactive texts. They're very delicate ecosystems, and there's not a good way to preserve them yet. So we're trying to put that on the policy agenda, and also try to figure out some ways to do that. But unfortunately, I have to also be there, so I won't be able to stay for much of this conference, and I apologize for that. A lot of words up here, and I guess in a nutshell, I mean, I'm glad this talk comes together with this conference, because I think, as far as I understand what's happening, my French is not so good. I think it fits pretty well, because this is very much about what we do with cinematic notions, how they can help shape our thinking, inform our conceptualization when we move into new spaces, new media spaces. And in particular today, I want to talk about three types of transaction that have to do with organizing event and sequence and time. Three different approaches. Interactive, this comes from my work with interactive documentary. Algorithmic assembly, this is something that's just starting to emerge, and I think we'll see a lot more of this. I think those two are quite related, the kind of lean forward interactivity and sit back algorithmic assembly. And the third thing is quite different and really has to do with virtual reality and is a notion of embodied montage. These, the framework I want to put these in, and that's why I'm grateful for being here. Andre has done so much to shape my thinking about the early history of editing practices in cinema. It's been remarkably formative work for the field, and two things really strike me. One of them is how different the valences and meanings of these words are in English and in French. They're really profoundly, they have profoundly different meanings. If you read David Bordwell on découpage, you have a completely different idea of what that term means than if you read Mitry or if you read French scholars. I mean, it pops up and it works in very different ways. And these are terms that work quite differently over time. So if you were to take a term like montage and think about what that word means, let's say for people that are there at the beginning, for people like Vertov and Eisenstein, completely different ideas of what montage is. On the most rudimentary level, we could talk about assembly, of course, it's constructing shot-to-shot relations. But for someone like Vertov, montage is a technique to reveal the world, to show reality as it is, and to show the trick of showing reality. Not just to show reality, but to reveal how that reality is shown. But if you look at Eisenstein's notion of montage, it's rhetorical. It's about constructing meaning. So here we have two contemporaries using the same language, writing manifestos about them, and meaning really quite different things. And if you multiply that times time and nation, you get a huge history of what these things mean. So I've really been informed, it's very small on the screen here, but by Timothy Bernard's work, by Laurent Leforestier's work. There's a study that's coming out with Caboose, Montage, Découpage, Mise en Scène. Frank Kessler, my colleague from Utrecht, is one of the authors. Jacques Aumon's work, naturally, where they've really, I think, been very good about historicizing these terms and showing, in a sense, they can mean many things. There's a lot of interpretive flexibility in what these terms mean. We can always take a stand and should take a stand, but I've tried to take a sort of agnostic approach, an outsider's approach to be inspired by these long-term debates and these national cultural differences, and to try to maybe put these terms in conversation with new media spaces. Yeah, it's not Vertov, is it? It's good, darn. I want to mention one little problem before we take off, and then we'll start this thing. So, virtual reality. A lot of people talk about virtual reality, and there's a fundamental problem with our use of that word, and it's that we mean by that two radically different technologies, two radically different epistemologies, aesthetics, even ethical systems. One is 360 video, and that's the most common form you would see. If you look at the New York Times use of VR, it's with a little Google Cardboard. Or if you go to YouTube and look at virtual reality, those are 360 videos. And in fact, these are fixed assets. The world is a fixed world, as a video world is always fixed. You can trigger hotspots. There's a little bit of interactivity possible, but basically it's a fixed world, and it's a fixed world that actually goes back to Robert Parker's idea of the panorama back in 1787. I mean, it's a very old idea. So, but if we look at real-time capture, this is the kind of VR that's done with scanning. So you might use Kinect, or you might use a laser scanner, LiDAR, or you might use photogrammetry. These systems permit very different types of interaction. These are contingent systems. They're systems where interaction is always possible, where what's revealed is different for each user, depending on where they're standing or what they're seeing. So we use one word to mean two radically different things, and that's a bit of a problem, because I'll say VR and you're never going to be sure which one I mean. But to give an example of, because this is a relatively new medium, I think the question of editing, the question of sequencing time and event is a really pressing problem. How do we do it in a world like this? Or how do we do it in an interactive world? And I think cinema, the language of cinema, has been the source of inspiration for many makers. Many of the makers coming to this world come from having made video or having made film, and then they step into the VR world. And they bring with them a mentality, an idea of technique, an idea of what's appropriate from the two-dimensional world into this three-dimensional circular world. And it leads to some very predictable problems. And I'm going to let Buster Keaton do the talking here. I'm sure you know Sherlock Jr. And this is a sequence where Keaton he's having a dream, and the dream is he's jumped onto the movie screen, and he finds himself in a world, immersed in a world, over which he has no control over the cutting. And this is, for those of you who've used VR, especially bad virtual reality, this should be a very familiar experience. You're in a world, you're looking around, you're immersed, you're starting to even think you're there, and all of a sudden there's a cut and you're in another world. It's a cinematic idea of editing imposed on a world, an immersed world. And this is a very unsettling feeling. And to me, it's this little clip is a good. Let's wait for the joke here. Yeah. Okay. It's a really good example of the problem in the virtual reality world of not really thinking through the translation from cinema to an immersive world. So what I want to do is go through these three things that I mentioned: interactive, algorithmic, and embodied. The first two will deal with certain kind of text. The third will deal with VR, and see how can we productively use these ideas, or even can we use productively the ideas from cinema into this new space. Can I first ask, how many of you have worked at all with interactive texts, interactive documentaries, or interactive narratives? Have many of you seen any of these? There's even some makers of them here. Yeah, okay, good. If I were to summarize conceptually what's going on, the world of cinema is very much like a bus ride, a bus tour of the city, a guided tour. Huh? You have a narrator, someone who has organized a plan, who takes you in a route through the city and explains to you what's happening, where you should look, what you should watch, what you should learn. It's informative. If the tour guide is good, it's fun, and you come away better than you started the experience. It's great. But we also all know that experience of being in a new city and just kind of wandering, walking around, finding our own path. We see different things. We notice the names of streets a little more carefully because we have to get back home. We watch whether the numbers of the streets, the houses are going up or going down. We might stop at a shop window or even go inside. It's a very different experience of the city. One is not better or worse than the other. In fact, they both work together pretty well. But I would say the first example, the bus ride, is something like cinema that we've experienced, huh? Where there's a narrator, there's a story, there's a structure that everyone shares in, and we all go for the same ride. And the bottom is a little more like interactive, in the case that I work with, documentary, where there are many different paths, many different routes possible, where there are still streets, there are still paths. We can't walk through buildings. There are many places we cannot go, but still there's a lot of freedom for us to kind of explore it our own way. So if you're interested in this space, we have an archive of a curated collection of hundreds of these things called DocuBase, and you can see anything I'm talking about and hundreds of things more. And it's curated. If you go to this for the first time, if you look at the very top of the screen, it's PR for projects, PL for playlists. Playlist is the place to start because there are curated collections by different people, makers, critics, festival organizers. That's a good way to go at it. Anyway, what's interesting to me from a media perspective is that these are often things that look a bit film-like, but that have different affordances, different uses, but also have different possibilities of distribution. In this case, this is an interactive documentary that appears on the pages of the digital pages of the newspaper, The Guardian. Kat Sizek's Short History of the High Rise. Kat was working with National Film Board here in Canada. Got an Emmy for that project, distributed through the pages of the New York Times, the digital pages. So this really, at a time when documentary is having difficulty reaching broad audiences beyond TV and the screen, we can see that the digital, in this case, offers a kind of new set of platforms. The newspaper, for example. It offers, in this case, it's stories from 10 historians, but also a lot of different visual material, things you can move in and out of. There are pathways. There are 10 pathways if you want to follow those, but you can also mix and match as your interest. If you're not interested in this story, you can jump to that story. So there's some freedom of movement allowed. Um, but ultimately, a lot of what this is made of are short little sequences, edited sequences that would look very familiar from a film perspective. Um, this is by Kat Sizek, part of a large project called High Rise, multi-year, multi-part project. You can interact with various stories in this world through geography. You see a map on the top, and you could go to Amsterdam and click that button and enter a 360-degree space of stories about someone's life in Amsterdam. Or you could approach it through character. You could sort of go through these people on the bottom and enter a story through an individual. Or you can enter through one of these apartment buildings. And in each case, you enter a world, a 360 world. This is an old project for 360, that has many different story elements embedded within it that, again, are traditionally edited units within a very different framework. A framework of interactivity that includes things that look, in fact, somewhat traditional. Again, another example, the interface looks very abstract. Another National Film Board project here about homelessness in Canada. And an experiment to give, they spent $100 million to give some people housing and other people could live on the street, and then they compared their experiences, their lives. So it looks very abstract, but were you to click on any of those dots, two things happen. One, you would jump into a sort of traditional looking documentary clip, but you would also be connected. You would also see other relevant things you might want to see that are connected to that story. So in a way, you can build your own story, but the units that you're building it of are actually quite traditional in terms of their editing structure. This would also be an interactive documentary, but it's pretty much data visualization. Not much story, nothing that really looks much like film. It's really just data that you can manipulate and kind of construct. Could be a narrative experience, but it's not using the film clips that the previous ones. So all to say, this interactive space covers a lot of different forms, but a lot of them, in fact, use traditionally edited micro units. Maybe we could call them micro narratives that we can assemble, mix and match as we want, kind of like a Lego set of mini narrative blocks. So kind of what I just said, many interactives share traditionally edited sequences or micro-narratives that we navigate or that we assemble. But there, of course, are other kinds where we, like hunters and gatherers, we sort of find data and put it together our own way. Okay. Now I want to jump to, we'll come back to all this. I want to jump to algorithmic assembly. This is very much on the verge of, in fact, just started to happen in the world of moving image. But you can expect to see lots more of this soon. The algorithmic is a fraught space. It's a space that makes people uneasy. It yields images like this that are real but kind of not real. There's something wrong with this picture. I don't know where these get. It's like a horror film in the making. These kids. It's accurate and it's uncanny at the same time. There's like something not quite right. And there's a sense in which the word algorithm in our culture is a word that's loaded with maybe a little more meaning than it deserves. Because in fact, an algorithm is nothing more than a recipe. It's a simple formula. It's value neutral. It doesn't care what the values are. It cares what the relationships are. So just like a cookie recipe, you can make, or whatever those are, coffee breaker recipe. You can make like a little bit or you can make a lot. The recipe controls the ratios. So that's an algorithm, in fact. There's nothing sinister about it, despite its deployments. Now, and of course, in the world of the digital, an algorithm, an ancient concept, goes back to the Egyptians, in fact, the ancient Egyptians. The pyramid is, in fact, you could argue, uses algorithmic principles for its construction. Euclid writes about the algorithm in 300 before Christ, so it's an old idea. But with the computer, it's suddenly gained a lot of new power. And certainly with digitization, with film, we can start to imagine thinking about a film or thinking about the editing process, as someone like Lev Manovich has done in his work on the database, the film as a database, you can start to imagine thinking about this from a somewhat new perspective. This wouldn't have been easy in the pre-digital era, this kind of an image. Anyway, I want to point to 3 different techniques in algorithms that are changing the way we assemble experiences. First of all, story generators. These are quite widely used in the world of the printed word. This is an article from 2015. These really start to be used by the press around 2012, 2013. Right now, they're probably generating about 1 billion stories per year that you would probably never guess were written by an algorithm. Anything with structured data, so like a sports event or a financial story where there's a timeline and an event marker, that data can go into the computer and come out as a story that you cannot tell, for the most part, cannot tell was written by an algorithm. These are very, very, like a lot of the online stories you read, a lot of BuzzFeed reports, that kind of stuff, will be algorithmically generated. But also the New York Times, Fortune, they often will use, they'll sign off, this name gets used a lot, narrative science. If you see the name narrative science, you can guess it's an algorithm that wrote the story. And basically, these start entering the world around 2012 for structured data. You put in structured data, you get out a story, like instantly. You can personalize the story instantly. But now the point they've reached is a point where you can drop the algorithm into a box of data and it finds patterns, it finds stories. So they're using it for poetry, they're using it for fiction. Mixed results, but it's developing quite quickly. So this is a space that's really quite developed now in the world of print, and it's coming our way. And it's coming our way in media because of this, because of huge advances, massive advances in image recognition algorithms. The past 2 or 3 years have seen incredible progress. This has been a very slow area, image recognition, because it requires training the algorithms to identify images, to separate image from background, are you looking at the car because it's yellow, or because it's a Ford, or because it's a car, or because it's parked? There's a lot of different meanings embedded in a car on the street. So which is it? Well, this problem is being solved very, very rapidly. Huge implications for us because a lot of what's in archives is only accessible through keywords that someone hand wrote. Imagine if the algorithm could really do a content analysis and tell you if you're looking for such and such a thing, it can find it right away. Like, this is going to change our lives in the old legacy world of cinema. But it's also starting to change the world of how we can assemble images and tell stories. If you think that YouTube right now, I say this everywhere I go because it's such an astounding number. Does anyone know the upload rate? How much video is being put into YouTube right now per minute? 400 hours of video per minute. 67.5 years of video being put on YouTube per day. Now, that's a lot of stuff, and it's too much to comprehend, I think. But if we had algorithms that could sort of sort through on the fly and find what we were looking for, we would have an incredible repository of material to work with. As it is, it's useless because it's just too much. So these tools are getting much, much better, exponentially better right now. I mean, just the past 2 years, 2.5 years, it's just it's one of those little diagrams, nothing, 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 and then boom, off it goes. So that's the space we're in with image recognition. And if you combine that with storytelling generators, something can happen. Third factor I want to talk about with algorithms is taste prediction. I'll point here to one of my neighbors in Boston, a company called EchoNest. So EchoNest basically is a taste predictor. It tries to figure out your tastes and extrapolate past is prologue, that great English saying, past is prologue. Based on what you've done, we can guess where you will go next. It leads to a very small world. I mean, I'm not saying these are good things, but they are things. If any of you use Spotify or Pandora, where the basic feature, or if you use Amazon, if you keep the cookies on with Amazon, or even your Google search, Google Now, that kind of thing, where they're really trying to figure out, based on what you've done, what is next. This technology is also getting quite good. So imagine putting these three together. Imagine knowing what a viewer likes, being able to find that imagery on the fly and assemble it per person. We're already doing that in the world of print, and it's coming our way. And I just want to point to a couple of quick examples of how these algorithms are actually shaping, beginning to shape our storytelling capacity. This company, Epigogics, really focuses on more the funding of productions. It doesn't actually make anything, it just gives the green light to money. The people in Hollywood hate this. This company started as a risk management company, and they're looking around, fire or theft or whatever, and they stumbled across this idea: making movies, like making Hollywood movies, that's pretty risky too, because it takes what, $50 million, $100 million. You might make something, you might make nothing. You might make a lot, you might lose everything. So they started to tweak their algorithms to actually predict, based on certain casting decisions. They would take a script, a bunch of casting decisions, feed it into the computer, and come out with 70% chance of this kind of revenue over this kind of time. And they're often right. They're right enough that the investors like it. The Hollywood guys, where it comes from the nose, they know it's going to be a good one or a bad one. They can feel it. That's the connoisseurship. They hate this. But the point is, statistically, it's more accurate than less, and the investors kind of like it. So this is weird, but it's happening. On the side of actual production, actually making and assembling footage, there is a lot of software out now that's starting in this space, and this would be an example: emotion sense technology. It's trying to sort out, in a sense of image recognition and preference, what the emotional cadences are of certain images and certain relations between images. Magisto is I'm pretty sure it's an Israeli company that really is probably in the lead. This is one you can just go to now and play with if you want. There's a beta that you can play with this, where it's stabilizing the image, it's recognizing faces, it's analyzing scenes, and then assembling. It's offering a kind of storytelling assembly of images that it's selected. So if you go to their website, you get this really, like, if any of you have used Wix to make a web page, it's idiot proof. Like, oh, select your files, drop in a photo, pick a theme, and it will presto magic, it makes little films for you, and there's a lot you can look at here. So again, not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm saying this is a coming thing. We're looking at the cutting edge of technologies that permit not so much the bus ride, but offering each of us a little bit of a path. One good example, if you want to see some algorithmic editing that the National Film Board has produced, is the project Seances by Guy Madden. This is a great, if you don't know this project, you should, because it's very much about the death of cinema. Every time you look at a film, you're the only and last person to see it. It will never come back again. So really, every experience you have is an algorithmically assembled film, and you are the only person to see it. It disappears forever after you've viewed it. So it's a project that's about loss. It's a project, if you know Guy Madden's work, of course, it's a project very much in dialogue with cinema's profound history, but also its crisis, the fear that we're losing some of our heritage and that it might not be around anymore. And it does it, of course, by using the most advanced digital techniques, by using algorithms as story generators. Not all of the stories are great, but a lot of times it works pretty well, generates the titles. It can be a really fun project to see. So here we have these three components of recognition: image recognition, prediction, taste prediction, and automatic assembly, essentially taking the work that we talked about with interactive documentaries and making it automatic. This is a prejudice of mine. I think the world is divided into two kind of people. People that don't mind leaning forward to click their way through a documentary, to interact with the screen and make stuff happen. That's a certain kind of person. But there's another kind of person that just likes to sit back, relax, and have the story unfold. Algorithms can now take over that work of leaning forward. You can sit back and still have a personal, uniquely generated, basically an interactive experience where you don't have to interact. The algorithm does it. So these are two modalities, and we're watching one of them emerge right now. Again, this is based often on pre-existing edited units or micro narratives, and it's that I want to question. Like, what are we talking about with these little units in the end? Okay. Now I want to go to this notion of embodied montage, and here I'm going to step over to the world of virtual reality. And I told you at the front end, there's like two types of virtual reality: 360 and the real-time capture, the stuff that's more laser-based or Kinect-based or photogrammetry-based. This stuff is in that latter category: Kinect, photogrammetry. So images that we can really, in spaces that our every movement has implications for that space. This term comes from one of my students, a guy who wrote his thesis last year, Dennis Tordum. Dennis is Turkish, and he wrote a really terrific master's thesis. It's online if you want to look at it. That really sort of, this guy's an experimental filmmaker for his bachelor's degree. Went to Bard College in the States, so very much a filmmaker who stepped into the world of especially VR and tried to translate some of the concepts from cinema that he cut his teeth on, very classical kind of cinema training, to see what that meant. And he came up with this idea, and it's I think it's a very useful one in the world of VR. And let's just explore why that is. So right now, if you look at VR, we're kind of in the first and second generation. First generation is this 360 stuff that I mentioned, really more like video than anything else, in fact. Second generation, if you use Oculus, if you've had any experience with Oculus Rift or HTC Vive, you can use your hands, you can see your hands in the world, you can manipulate objects, you can pick things up or break them or whatever. Okay, that's where we are now. What's around the corner is this third generation. I mean, it's out. We work with it, but it's not. It's expensive and not easy to buy right now. The third generation actually works a lot with eye tracking. So you might know that the company Oculus was purchased by Facebook for $2 billion. And if you ever wondered why, it's that third thing. Because basically they're going to track what you're looking at. They can see by how your pupils move if you're interested or not. And that data becomes more interesting than your Google footprint. This is the data that matters in terms of you as a consumer. So that's the real project here, although they never talk about it. But anyway, this technology has a lot of problems and ethical problems, but it's got a lot of possibilities in terms of aesthetics. And so basically, they're tracking your every movement of your eye, and they're reading your pupil dilation. They're reading your pulse. There's a fair amount of metrics they can get from eye movement right now. It's called foveated rendering, and this just sort of tracks what you do. But this can also be a trigger for assembling material in a world. So basically, let's say this to explain. So to explain Dennis's idea of embodied montage, basically with his experiments, he would take. So you're looking with two eyes. You're looking around. And he would basically like make one eye go a little bit soft, a little out of focus. Physiologically, there's some principle where our good eye always compensates for the bad eye. If one of your eyes goes a little blurry, the good eye dominates. You only see a clear image. But it feels a little weird. Like I can only say when he did some experiments with this, and let me say it that way. He asked me to put on the goggles, and I'm in a scene, and at a certain point, I leave the scene. I wanted to leave. So this is a scene where I can really walk around in the scene. And afterwards, he said, "Why did you leave the scene when you left it?" I don't know, I was bored. No, think about it. Why did you leave? And I said, well, it sounds strange, but I felt like something was tapping on my eye. And he said, why did you leave? Why did you move right? I said, I felt like something was tapping on my left eye, and I just kind of wanted to move. I wanted to be somewhere else, and I moved the other direction. 9 out of 10 people have that response, and you don't see the softening of focus. You sort of feel it, and invariably you move the other direction. So he's trying to use this as a way to structure a scene. Like right now, right now what happens in VR is if there's something that they want you to look at and you're not moving, there'll be a sound cue, so you'll hear something over there and our instinct is to look at what we hear. Or in really bad examples, there will be like a red arrow floating in the middle of space that says like, look that way, idiot, and you do. Those work, but they're maybe not so great. With this idea of montage, it's actually about our physical self. It's manipulating our physiological responses. It's embodied. So that he can pretty much steer a viewer through a scene. He can decide when you should leave, which direction you should leave in, what you should look at next, in a way that you think is you, but it's actually your physiology is being toyed with. It's a very interesting concept, and maybe not so different from what Eisenstein and Vertov were up to in terms of kind of manipulating our associations, putting the sword and the baby and us thinking, oh, something traumatic just happened. This is maybe not so conceptually different from that space. Okay. There's another direction. I won't go into this much, but this is worth saying because this very same technology doesn't really need a human actor behind it. These are images that are as easy for humans to read as for machines to read and for machines to act on. So a lot of what's happening now in warfare or security systems doesn't really need a human image. And Farocki has this really nice term, the operational image, for images that do things. So Dennis's point is a slightly different one, but these are kind of, you can see that these are slightly related concepts. I have this image up simply as a reminder that what I'm talking about with virtual reality actually also makes sense in the coming world of augmented reality. When what you're looking at here is a project by a Berlin-based company, Art Plus Com, where they've basically gone back to the archive and digitized films from every decade that have to do with Berlin. So nonfiction images or any fiction films that use Berlin locations. So what you're looking at on the bottom is the transformation from what looks like a screen. It's probably a film from on the Leipziger Straße from maybe 1910 or something. And they spatialize it. It's a tracking shot, so it winds up looking like a shoebox. And basically, they give you this map that you can see, this exploded map with different years. And on that map are these artifacts, these 3D artifacts that really are spatialized films. If it's a pan shot, it might look like a wheel of cheese. And you can enter that and bang, the movie starts. And you just go through that tracking shot and you wind up on the other side. And these things are being spatially embedded, augmented reality, they're being embedded in the city. So that if you were to go to the Leipziger Straße, you wouldn't see that. You wouldn't see that green thing unless you had the goggles on, they're glasses. You can see through them, you can see the world, but you can see what's also on the glass. So it's not like VR where you're cut off from the world. Here you see the world with an overlay. You see that thing, and if you were to walk over to the front, stand on the street and get killed, if you didn't get killed, you would see that movie. You could walk through that movie. So it's a very intriguing concept. I mean, it's all very prototypey right now. But again, in terms of embodiment, these are experiences, these are audiovisual experiences that only work because of the positioning of our body. Our body has to be in the right place. Our body has to be oriented in the right direction. So it's a kind of, in this case, I wouldn't call it embodied montage, but embodied, well, spectatorship is always embodied, isn't it? But this is a kind of embodiment as the interface to this audiovisual stuff. Okay, so all to say, in this brave new world of VR and AR, invisible optical and sound would be invisible, cues guide user behaviors, shape our construction of experience, including narrative. Okay, so let's close out here. Here's Uncle Walt Disney, telling us about his theme park. And in some ways, if you think about what both interactive, algorithmic, and even VR experiences, especially the Kinect and the real-time capture VR, basically what these are environments of possibility. This is not the bus ride. This is not one street, one machine, one group of people. This is like a city, or it's like a theme park with a lot of possible paths that we can take. And the question is, what's the nature of those streets? What's the nature of those paths, those pre-edited bits, those experiences that have been structured by an author, but that we can decide when to tune in and tune out and what to do with it. I talked at the beginning about the bus ride, and here's maybe another way to say it. It's great to sit back and listen to a story. Nothing finer. To be carried along in your imagination with a good teller. And that's today's cinema. That's the history of the last 100 plus years of cinematic storytelling. But it's also pretty cool to tell your own story, to be in your own world, to inhabit your own characters. Now, obviously, this requires a bit of a shift in our idea of narrative. If we take the literary notion of narrative, it's always a past tense event. It's always the retelling of something that happened. But I would argue to you that our experience of narrative as it unfolds is always in a present. And that present is the same present that happens when you're playing pirates. It's a present that unfolds. It's a structured, rule-bound world. There are still rules. If you're a pirate, you can't suddenly pull out your laser gun and make everyone disappear. It doesn't work. You broke the rule set. So it is a bound, it is a bound universe. There are structures to it, but its affordances are quite different. And this is the space where we're getting a lot of technology that's helping us to sort of imagine building out these kind of experiences. Now, you could say in a way, to be perverse, you could say, in a way, when Bazin talks about this kind of a setup, allowing us to kind of pick and choose what to look at, giving us the freedom of, the filmmaker has, of course, given some structure here, very careful structure and very careful attention to light, but still, depending upon our gender, our interest, our experience, we could actually come away from this scene with very different readings, having seen very different things. And I would say that what I'm talking about are structures that amplify those possibilities, rather than the more Eisensteinian, this is the shot and it's so fast you don't have a choice, this is what you get. Here, this ambiguity, this potential for highly differential readings is something that these new technologies are amplifying. So, of course, the usual stuff people talk about here, and it's relevant stuff. This is a kind of collaborative authorship. Makers have structured a world. They've structured shots. They've structured sequences. They've structured the city plan, you might say, the streets in the city. But we, the user, decide which streets to walk on. We decide which moments to stop and where to look. So there's kind of a relationship here. It's not simply an authored text that we sit back and enjoy. Secondly, these are very unstable textual forms. In cinema, some of our agenda has been to find the right version, to assemble, to find the bits that have been cut out and exist in Montevideo or Berlin, and we assemble the proper version of Greed as best we can. Here the question is not that. There is no proper text. It's always a different experience. Again, like play or like a touring the city. And there's a shift in our meaning of narrative from a sort of fixed structure to something that's more experiential, that we experience. We have something like a narrative experience that lets us bind these bits together and make them coherent. So what interactivity brings to the table is an ability to step away from a fixed structure. We can make a lot of decisions. The algorithm will do that for us. It assumes, it tries to understand our interests, it tries to understand the footage, and it tries to give us the story that it thinks we want. So that's what's happening in that world of interactivity. But in the VR world, we're going to these semi-structured and embodied choices, something that our body can, in fact, be the bearer of. Our body structures the experience, what we see and where we look, how we move around in the space. And that's something that can be structured. It's not just raw experience. And so I guess the question I want to leave you with, and it's what I was thinking about as I wrote this. So does this help us? Decoupage is a really rich term, and it means, it's, again, what I said at the beginning, it's something that can mean something quite specific to something that can be very vague and open. But really, it's about, because I like its openness. I like the openness of this term in terms of its ability to sort of capture like a continuity script or like a shooting script. It's something where someone has imagined a sequence. Just as a city designer might imagine different streets or a park with many different paths, in a sense, decoupage becomes something quite plural here. I'm not sure if decoupage, and I'm trying to think this through, and I'm really going back and trying to read a lot now on the deeper history of decoupage across cultures. But I think it might be a useful term, maybe, and maybe not, to sort of think, what are these, how do we think about all these multiple paths that a city or a park or a theme park might have that are sort of structured, someone's imagined them, but that I have a lot of freedom about which one to engage with. Um, um, so the question, I guess, I think I'm at over my mark here. The question I want to leave you with then is, so what kind of language, now that we have these new technologies and new ways to experience things, what kind of language will we use to describe them? Will we take it from domains like cinema or theater, architecture, whatever? There's a lot of spaces to think about. Some more fully interactive and spatial than others. Decoupage, it's proven to be a very expandable term. Should we give it another twist? Or because it would be nice to keep these experiences bound with the bigger concept of cinema, linguistically and theoretically. But is that useful? Or do we need to make a break and say this is something radically different? I think that would be a mistake. I think that would make cinema a weaker cultural force. But on the other hand, old wine in new bottles doesn't always work either. So this is maybe the question to leave you with, whether to give it a new twist or not. And it's useful to go back to these moments and see how people tried to describe something for which there wasn't really language. Do they borrow existing language and reuse it, or do they just invent something new? So thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you, William, for this extremely stimulating presentation and relevant and pertinent to our age. I'm going to turn now towards the audience for questions, and I'm going to give the first question to Andre Gaudreau.
Uh-oh.
Thank you very much, William, for this inspired. Thank you very much, William, for this very much inspired and inspiring talk. I'd like to come back on one point. Well, first, before coming back to one point, I have to say something. You touched at the beginning a question that is at the center of our reflection, Laurent Forestier and myself, all together with Timothy Barnard, because he's translating what we're doing, especially the future #1 book of Technes, because the way we see the thing is that really the two different linguistic community have a totally different approach to montage. Well, first in French, in English you have borrowed montage for many reasons, from the French to the English. But also is that, you know, and we work a lot with Santiago also, because he's working on these questions of montage, editing. And at least one thing that is important is that montage, in French, montage relates to something like a structural idea of putting things together. Montage comes from there, whereas editing comes from the universe or the domain of journalistic domain. Editing, choice, editorial. So editorial has a meaning that montage doesn't have at all. So that's one point. The point where I'd like to see how you would react is that sometimes it's important to see the limits of our examples or the way we try to exemplify our talks. And one thing that struck me is that I liked a lot your division between the two metaphors. One is the bus tour, and the other one is the self-deambulating in the city. But what struck me is that even though we could say, yes, it's interesting, the bus tour, because people are in a bus, they look at the window, and each window is kind of a plan shot, or, you know, something like that. Maybe there's a découpage. But in fact, in a bus tour, there's no découpage. It's a continuous plan séquence. So it's the same thing with the deambulating in the city. So how would you go with this, with the example you gave? How would you react to this?
Well, so if I don't want to press the metaphor too literally, I would say that like any experience of a film, audiences come away with radically different impressions of what they've seen. They've all sat through the same experience, they've looked at the same screen, and you ask them what they saw, and they give you completely different answers. And that's a little bit the Bazin image, the Wells image I showed at the end. We have a deep focus shot. What really do we see? And it turns out we see, you know, I see one thing and my wife sees something completely different. She's been looking at the kid out the window, and I'm looking at the actress playing the mother and wondering, you know, what she was thinking about in that role. We come away having seen completely different elements. So I agree on a technical level, of course. It's not a perfect fit for cinema, but it is, if we want to bump that up and say, let's think of that kind of a narrative, a fixed narrative that everyone kind of goes along for the ride for, a narrator who's calling our attention. But you're right, we of course see different things, and I agree. You know, I guess it's Andre Malraux, when he talks about decoupage, he says a great thing, and he says it in a way I really like. He says, this is what allows us to turn theatrical space into cinematic space. That's decoupage. I think, wow, that's interesting. How do you go from this 3D world of real time into something that's actually structured differently and rearticulated differently for a screen? And I guess it's that sense I'm trying to say, how can we, so does decoupage help us move into this next world? Or maybe that Malraux would actually give us a good reason to say we need a new term because we're moving back into this 3D world, at least with VR. Maybe we need another kind of a concept. But I don't want to evacuate cinema because, in fact, so much of what's happening in these spaces, certainly the interactive space, so much of what it's made of are small little sequences, little montage sequences, and maybe even, depending on your definition, I think it's imagined in terms of decoupage. When someone really imagines all these different streets, all these different avenues, and structures them, I think decoupage is a relevant term. But I'm afraid Malraux makes me think it's both a good thing and a bad thing. But I love that idea of saying, how do we turn theatrical space into cinematic space? That's decoupage. That's the definition. It's like, wow, it's a nice open definition. It's an evocative definition. So what do we do next? Do we extend that term and say, well, it's proven to be pretty elastic and we can maybe stretch it to fit? Or do we need to come up with I have to improve my French, and because it has to be a French word, that's for sure. No, there's something really, what's great with the French language, I mean, it has a kind of evocation. There's because words are used in so many ways, they wind up being very, very rich. The carriers of a lot of information, as opposed to English or German, which tend to be pretty flat. It's unfair to say, but they're more, jouissance is not so important in those languages. And for you guys, it makes magic. And so I think it should be a French word, but what that word is, I don't know. I'd love to provoke you and say, what should it be? There's an opening there in the field.
Marta?
Thank you very much for the presentation. So my question is a little bit more about the status of the medium in a larger way. So when the question when we assume that our choices are embodied is what do we do with the cultural and community-based experience of cinema, of television, of any other medium. So, for example, when you take the image of the kids around the teacher for storytelling, of course, there is a question of being in a setting, but of course there is, as any oral storytelling, also some sort of feedback that influences the way the story unfolds. So my question is, is there some, my remark is there is some sort of agency from the viewer, even when we are in a closed setting, of course. And so I'm fascinated by the idea of taste prediction engines and all sort of things that you showed. But my question is, do these things really work? Assuming that, for example, when I choose music that I want to listen to or a film, of course, it's not only my embodied experience, but also what my friends will tell me, etc., and how will I look.
And they track that. That's
So,
information they
yeah.
track, of course.
So
Because,
yeah, I was wondering what kind of information
Yeah.
really goes into that.
yeah. So that's a really good question. And culture and community. Culture is a really huge question here. And so I can say that, and I would say the world kind of boils down into people that are culturalists and are open to interpretive flexibility and the possibility of, they have free will in good Catholic terms. And then there's those kind of Calvinist world of like fixity and like you're predestined and, you know, that's that. And there's the more, far more empirical and in academia, maybe we define it between media studies in the humanities and arts and mass communication studies over in the social sciences, which can be very, I don't know, do you guys make that distinction? If you talk to the other side, things can be quite fixed. They can be quite, let's see what the numbers tell us. And that's a bit slippage in this space because a lot of this new agenda is being driven by corporations that like numbers, that believe numbers. Netflix, for example. Netflix has had a famous $1 million competition back in 2007, maybe. I don't know when. They had 2011. They had their $1 million like algorithm competition to see who could boost their level of prediction the most. And the company that won had a 10.4% boost in accuracy on predicting taste. So from an engineering perspective and from a social science perspective, this is a problem that you can chip away at. Every year you get 2% better, 5% better. You know, they see this as a quantifiable problem, not a cultural problem. This is a purely engineering problem, and if you keep tweaking the algorithm, it will become more and more correct. I think on the one hand, I think that's a crazy idea, and on the other hand, they're doing it. So I'm a bit caught between those two. I think culture matters profoundly, of course, and I don't know I don't really know, and it's a really interesting question to put to Google and Amazon and Echo Nest, because they do segment their markets. The way that Spotify and Pandora work in France is profoundly different than the way it works in the Netherlands or UK. But because we have very mixed cultures right now, how does that work? Is it simply a linguistic marker for some big category, or are they really looking just by your title choices? If you're looking at French language stuff, does that suddenly kick in a different set of algorithmic choices? So the culture issue with these quantifiable technologies is a really, really important one. And I don't really have an answer for it, except to say these guys are driven by the notion of improvement, improved statistics. They're showing that. And to the extent that people keep going back to it or keep letting Amazon predict books for them, sad to say it works really well for me. Amazon really has figured me out. And maybe that's a bad thing to admit, but it's true. The community question, I think, is a really serious one, especially with goggle technologies, especially with virtual reality. Isabel and I were talking about this last night, and frankly, I'm a little bit pessimistic about these non-community experiences. Now, there is social VR, and maybe that will improve. My experiences so far have been ridiculous. I wind up in a virtual space with a guy from China who doesn't speak English and someone from Romania that sort of speaks English, and I don't speak Romanian or Chinese, so we sit there and look at each other, and it's not very social. Maybe that will improve. I think there are, just as we could all become immersed in a novel, and we don't want to be social, we just want me and my book for until I finish the book. I'm sure those experiences are there. Those are highly immersive experiences. I'm sure for the worlds of pornography and the worlds of real estate sales and there are certainly niche applications where people have their own fantasies and want to do it alone. But as a mass medium, I have my doubts. I think community is crucial. Uh, so I hope, you think dystopic long term, maybe we're becoming these little individuated units that are where the sociality is being removed and control becomes easier for the state. I mean, that's my nightmare, but I won't be here to see it. I hope that's not the case. I hope community remains vital. And that's where I think augmented reality becomes far more interesting, both because it's in the world and we can see the world, but also a vision, and because it's much easier for people to contribute and annotate and make it a community endeavor. But I think community is a really, really important question to ask with these, especially some of these edgier new technologies like VR. That said, I think with interactive, I think actually the idea of individuated texts, me having one set of experiences and you having another with the same object, with the same high-rise project, is actually interesting because it gives us something to talk about. And if you think of how a newspaper works, none of us read everything in the same order. We pick and choose what we want, we read it in different sequence, and it gives us something to debate and discuss. And I read this and you read that, and oh, let's talk. So I would say that even in our fixed textual forms like newspapers, really we have a high degree of interactivity and textual differentiation. That's already part of our world. And I think so the interactive texts kind of fit more that model. But the closed off one and these unique experiences is, yeah, it's ethically, there's a lot to be said about the ethics in this space and especially the social ethics.
Comment vous vous appelez? Pardon?
Excuse-moi, je vais faire ça court.
Okay.
Thank you very much, William. I really enjoyed your presentation. I'd like to pick up from what André said about editing also being in relationship with an editorial or what we could call a curated space. This notion of curated space really has been obsessing me since the first time you showed me that we can't tell the difference between an algorithm written piece and a piece that's written by a human being. So the question I have for you, which there might be no answer right now, but what would be, and it's kind of a rock thrown in a puddle maybe, but what could we see as a difference between an interactive web doc that is a curated space with a number of data, a volume of data that has been chosen and curated so that it can be explored, versus an algorithmic navigation search where you look for something on Google. Let's say you're looking for a bed and breakfast, or you're looking for everything that has been written about the word découpage, which could be an interesting search. That is also a curated space, but made from algorithms. So you were talking about the relationship between découpage and space and experience. So how would you differentiate an interactive web doc that is curated versus a Google search that is also curated?
So the first thing, I mean, the obvious thing that comes to mind is scale. That the curation that occurs with one of the high-rise projects or with any of these interactives, it's a team has really crafted and authored and sort of picked a finite. If you were to see everything in the interactive documentary, it might take you 5 hours. But most people's experience is probably 20 minutes, a 20-minute walk across the park. But if you were to take every single path and look at every single thing, it might take a few hours, in fact. A little bit like a video game in that sense. And there are completionists who do that, but almost very, very few of them. So yeah, so with Google, you're talking about a set whose curation is simply limited to the filter becomes the curating agent. There's no set of artifacts that's been bound. In this world, you have a bound set of artifacts. Someone has chosen what to put in the world, and whether you do it or the algorithm does it, it's bounded and finite and pretty small. Yeah, curated. And the other is not curated, or if you wanted to say Google is the information of the world where curation occurs through the algorithmic filter. But that's huge. I mean, that's the scale problem. And I would say that, yeah, at a certain point, quantity like transforms quality. too much of something too much mustard can kill you, and this is definitely a case of way too much mustard. So I don't. To me, that's really it. I mean, we can think. I think curation. You can conceptually argue that curation is happening in both cases, except in one case it's the curation of the artifacts with a secondary pathing process, whether the algorithm or me, and in the other case, the only curation is through the filter that's allowing certain things to pop up, say with the word découpage in them. But that is that's only one level of curation, the filter curation. There's an unbound set of artifacts. It's infinite set of artifacts.
But what do we do with when we look for a book title and they say you will also like this book, this book, this book? That's very interesting.
Yeah, but that's the curation of the filter, right? It's bound. The set is bound only by the number of titles that have been digitized, so that's an unbound set. And the filter, there's a single filter that says, oh, we think. Now, to go to the echo nest question of taste prediction, these things they're not stupid. I mean, it's not just like a name association. It's also wherever possible, trying to use social data. Other people with your profile that they can track have had these patterns. So you're being aggregated not just against that data set of books in the world, you're also being compared to other users of books in the world. So other people who've used this have had these patterns. So the algorithms are doing a lot of work, but still the set is a kind of an unfiltered raw set. And I think what makes the experience, I wouldn't call that well, that's a kind of co-authorship, but not really. No, it's an imposition. It's a filter figuring out you and giving you what it thinks. Whereas in these worlds, there is co-authorship. Kat has really decided what shots are in there, what sequences are possible. There's a lot of stuff that you can't do even if you want to do it. You can't. She won't let you.
But we're not co-authoring with her, with that project.
Well, I would argue that to the extent that I can pick and choose what to do, I would argue that she would call that a collaborative, she would use the word collaborative creativity for that co-creativity is a big word, has also to do with the production end, for sure. And Kat Cizek is someone who does that. She works with her subjects to actually decide what to shoot and what bits to tell and all that.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt here. Thank you very much for this intriguing presentation. I encourage everyone if there has questions that were left unanswered, will you have time a bit after your presentation?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. You can carry on the conversation after the presentation while we set up for the next panel. Donc, merci beaucoup pour votre présentation.
Merci bien.